In our last episode, we learned about how an evil serial killing grifter named John Robinson met vulnerable women in fetish chat rooms and lured them out to Kansas by offering them things he would never deliver. When it broke in the early 2000s, some regarded this story as a kind of cautionary tale. Be careful who you connect with online. And the idea of meeting strangers from the internet was still somewhat novel, even if it was really no different than meeting people through personal ads, as people had been doing throughout the 20th century. And online dating, while it may feel very much like a 21st century invention, has actually been around in various forms for 3, 4, even 5 decades. Arguably since the 1960s, when computer dating services first appeared. And in the 80s, there were video dating services and TV shows like Love Connection, which offered contestants a choice of 3 potential first date partners from a video lineup. It all evolved, parallel to technology, in the direction of what we have today. Dating apps. Meeting people on dating apps has now become the norm. From Tinder to Bumble to Hinge, we live in the age of swipe culture. But in the pre-smartphone era, from the 90s through the late 2000s, singles looking for love online mainly used dating websites like OkCupid, Match.com, eHarmony, and Plenty of Fish. These websites actually still exist and are successful, but they've taken a backseat to the apps. And although there's always some element of danger to any situation where you're meeting and going on dates with strangers, online dating has always presented unique risks. In 2008, Giles Ziltatro's wife moved to Edmonton, Canada for work. This was their second big move in just a few years. And Giles stayed behind for a little bit so he could wait for their house to sell and also work some more, save a bit more money, and establish some security for them in their new city. But then after he moved to Edmonton to join her, his wife had a surprise in store for him. She wanted a divorce, and Giles was totally blindsided by this. At 33 years old, the last thing he was expecting was to find himself single again and alone in a totally new city. For some, this situation might be liberating, but not for Giles. He felt depressed and exhausted and suddenly very isolated. The idea of starting over for him was a scary one. But after a while, once the pain of his divorce subsided, he started thinking about dating again. And the thing is, because he had been married for the past 6 years, he'd pretty much forgotten how to meet women. He had no idea what the dating pool was like now and how to go about getting back into it. Though this time, the stigmas around online dating had begun to fall away and it was no longer just a novelty. The culture was changing so fast. Practically everyone was giving internet dating sites a try, using them to meet new partners. So Giles decided to explore the world of online dating. He began checking out the dating sites, and at first, he had a hard time finding interesting and interested people. And most of the sites required monthly subscriptions. But then he found Plenty of Fish, and he was amazed by the vast number of profiles on the site and the fact that he could sign up for free. So Giles created an account and chose his username, Dr_X, which is a username that had been in his rotation since his teens. You can sort of tell. And he filled out his profile. And suddenly, Giles, or Dr_X, was very much into browsing Plenty of Fish. He found himself spending hours a day at his computer, looking through profiles, looking for women that fit the characteristics he was looking for. Attractive, physically fit, intelligent, loyal, and a versatile conversationalist with many shared interests. I mean, that's what everyone's looking for, right? He messaged with a handful of women, but the conversation seemed to go nowhere. But then, a woman using the name Spiderwebs with 2 Z's caught his attention. Something about her was captivating to Giles. She was beautiful, with blue eyes and blonde hair, but accessible looking. She had the girl next door look that so appealed to him. And much like Giles, she too had just moved to Edmonton from British Columbia, where Giles was also from. And it seemed like they were at similar places both in life and in their dating adventures. In fact, they both joined the site at more or less the same time. So Giles sent the young woman an instant message, and he got a reply back almost immediately. She seemed very friendly and smart, and they engaged in some flirtatious banter back and forth. She told him that her name was Sheena, and that she lived in the Edmonton neighborhood of Millwoods. Giles appreciated that Sheena was opening up and sharing personal information at this stage of the interaction, as most of the other women he'd connected with on the site were reluctant to divulge. Sheena asked Giles if he had any plans that weekend, and Giles' heart started to race a bit because for him, this meant she probably wanted to meet up with him. And he was right. He told her he was free that weekend, and she asked if he wanted to hang out that Friday. Definitely, he told her. And then she was silent. Giles was now second-guessing his enthusiasm here. Maybe he should have played it cooler, he thought. Showed some restraint at least with the exclamation point. Man, I'm rusty at this game, he thought to himself. But she finally replied. I'll think about it, she wrote. So this just validated his insecurities. Damn, he thought, I lost her. He sat and stared at the screen, hoping she'd write back soon, hoping he hadn't blown it. And then another message came in. How about dinner and a movie? She asked. Sounds good, Giles wrote back, trying to find, the right tone so he wouldn't screw it up. Sheena explained that she didn't like to eat junk food at the movies, which is why she wanted dinner beforehand. I mean, dinner and a movie? It's a thing. No explanation needed, right? Seems perfectly reasonable and normal. For dinner, she suggested this place called Joey's Global Grill and Lounge at the mall in Edmonton. And then she proposed going to see Nick and Nora's Infinite Playlist, a movie that Giles had never heard of. But he was game. To him, it really didn't matter so much where they went or what they ate. What mattered was the chemistry between them. So the date was set for 7 o'clock that Friday, October 3rd, and she asked him to come pick her up, which he was totally okay with. But then she gave him some very specific instructions on what to do after he arrived to pick her up. She lived in a basement apartment inside of a house, she said, and he'd have to drive through an alley and park in the back of the house to access it, and then walk through the detached garage. This was how it had to be done, she said, because the curb in front of the house was a no parking zone, and the curb on the opposite side of the street was a bus stop, and the fence was padlocked because the back gate was broken, so he'd have to enter the backyard by first going through the garage. She said she'd leave one of the garage doors cracked so he could enter it. And then, once inside, all he'd have to do is walk through the backyard and knock on the door of the basement. This all seemed a bit strange to Giles, but then again, all of online dating was a strange new world to him, and he tried to look at this as an adventure, sort of like a puzzle or an obstacle course. Later that night, Giles sent Sheena a message telling her how excited he was to meet someone as interesting and beautiful as her. Then he went to bed again, wondering if he'd overdone it. The next evening, on Tuesday night, Giles opened his web browser to check his messages, and the browser app lagged for what felt like an eternity. Giles had butterflies in his stomach while he waited for that hourglass to turn into an arrow. And when it did, he opened Plenty of Fish, and there was a reply from Sheena. This felt good. He read her message, and it contained very precise, descriptive directions to the house, and even more detail concerning how to get in through the garage and access the basement door. But weirdly, she didn't include the specific address. Instead, she just described the house. Take a right on 40 Avenue, she wrote. After a block or two, take the very first right into the alley. It's marked by a yellow crosswalk sign, so pay attention. Then go left and pull into the only driveway on your left that isn't paved. Now, if this were me, I would be counting the red flags by this point. But it seems like Giles was just giving her the benefit of the doubt. Like maybe she just moved into the place and hadn't even memorized the address yet. Who knows? Don't worry about neighbors thinking you're a burglar, her message concluded. Everyone knows there's nothing valuable in there except for my car. Giles wrote back with some questions. He wanted her to clarify which door he was supposed to knock on and if going through the garage was the only way to access the backyard. Yeah, she replied. First visible back door coming out of the garage. Knock away. She wasn't really answering his questions to Giles' satisfaction, leaving him both frustrated and also concerned about blowing his chances. He wanted to be gentle, but he also wanted information that was concrete. The term catfish hadn't been coined yet, but it was still a concern people had with online dating, especially early on, that maybe you weren't talking to who you thought you were talking to. At least give me your phone number in case I get lost, Giles wrote back. Sheena replied that she didn't give out her phone number or address for safety reasons. But, she added, if the date went well, he could have her phone number, no problem. Now, Giles was feeling a bit weirded out by this, but like I said, he didn't want to sabotage it. And this was the first person that he'd felt genuinely excited about since meeting his wife more than 6 years ago. So he went to bed that night, but with apprehension, weighing on him. The next day, he sent her a quick message just to communicate this, however, indirectly. He wrote to Sheena, "If I don't show up, it's because I couldn't find your place." She then replied, There's certainly no other driveways along our alley like this one, and the half-open garage door is a dead giveaway. LOL, see you at 7 on Friday. This, of course, just wasn't helpful, and at this point, Giles was faced with a decision. He could continue pressing and risk spoiling the date, which he absolutely felt at this point would be the consequence of getting too pushy, or let it go. And Giles decided to let it go. And really, what he was feeling was, hey, this girl's pretty friendly and pretty forward. And after all, things had already moved pretty fast from the first message to having a date planned all in one day. So he felt pretty optimistic. Giles was confident that, at the very least, there would be a second date. On Friday morning, the morning of the big date, Giles went to work, already waiting for the day to end. He went through the motions of his workday, hardly able to focus on anything. And when his coworkers invited him to join for happy hour at the pub, as per usual, he astonished them by declining. This was a first. And then when the clock struck 6, all that remained of Giles at the office was a vapor trail. It took him 20 minutes to get home, leaving him only a short window of time to get ready, freshen up, change his clothes, and split. He'd already picked out his outfit that morning, so it was all laid out and ready to go. A short-sleeve black button-up, blue jeans, and a fashionable pair of slip-ons. Giles gelled his hair, grabbed his wallet and cell phone, threw on a jacket, and darted out the door. The dashboard clock read 6:45 p.m. when he set out on the road. And it seemed like he wasn't going to make it in time, but he had no phone number to call to tell Sheena that he was running late. He tried not to speed while driving toward her neighborhood, following the directions she gave him in her message. It was already getting dark, so he kept an eye sharply peeled for the landmark she gave him. A yellow crosswalk, first alleyway on the right, unpaved driveway. And there they were, one after the other. He took the right turn down the alleyway, and seeing the garage door partly cracked, he knew he'd reached the right location. He parked his truck in front of the garage door with the headlights facing it. He noticed a bunch of garbage and an old couch leaning up against the fence. And even though Sheena had mentioned this stuff in one of her messages, it still felt strange to him that someone would leave this stuff out for so long without it being picked up. He checked the time again, and it was now 7:15. He was 15 minutes late. He turned off the truck and stepped out and approached the garage door, which was open enough that all he needed to do was crouch a bit to get inside. Now, once inside the garage, he saw that it was pretty dirty, and there was some kind of dark film covering the windows. In one corner of the garage, he saw an old wooden chair and a steel drum. But what he was looking for was the door into the backyard. So intent Giles was on finding that he totally overlooked the green tarp that covered most of the other side of the garage and everything beneath it. Once he found the door, he made a beeline toward it, not wanting to be any later for his date than he already was. And as he reached out and turned the doorknob, someone, Sheena was his first thought, grabbed him from behind. And before Giles could even process what was happening, began beating him in the head. Then the person behind him reached around and pressed into his chest with what he later realized was a stun baton. Giles tried to run, but he got wedged between a pair of shelving units. When he turned around to face his attacker, he was horrified by what he saw. A figure in a hockey mask, painted black and gold, with their head covered completely by a hoodie. Chills ran down Giles' back. His heart was racing. He believed he was being mugged. The figure lurched forward with the stun gun and continued prodding Giles in the chest, though it wasn't having any noticeable effect. Giles struggled toward the garage door, and the figure continued trying to stun him with the baton. Giles grabbed the end of the baton and tried to wrestle it free from the man's hand. With his bare hand wrapped around the weapon, the man kept zapping him. But Giles was unfazed by this. He grew confident that he could overtake this guy and flee. But for some reason, which he would later realize were the sneaky effects of the stun baton, he barely had any muscle power, and the blows he kept landing were weak. And just then, the man drew a handgun and pointed it at Giles. Giles froze. The man ordered, "Get down on the ground, lie down on your stomach, put your head down, and put your arms behind your back." It was too dark in the garage for Giles to discern whether or not the gun was real, and he didn't want to call the man's bluff, so he complied. He got down on the floor of the garage and put his hands behind his back. "Look," Giles told the man, "take whatever you need. If you cooperate with me, you won't get hurt," the man replied. Well, that's what Giles was trying to do. "Take my watch, my wallet, whatever," Giles said. And as he lay on the floor of the garage, Giles could hear the man milling about. He was curious what the guy was up to, but every time he raised his head to take a peek, the man noticed and yelled at him to put his head back down. But then he stole another glance and saw the man handling a roll of duct tape. That's when Giles realized he wasn't being robbed. This was something far worse. "Put your head down and close your eyes," the man shouted. Giles heard a piece of duct tape being pulled and torn. Next thing he knew, it was over his eyes. He knew that he was about to die. Tears filled the tight pockets between the duct tape and Giles's eyes as he heard a jiggling sound behind him. It sounded like the man's belt. Giles now believed that he was about to be raped before being killed. His life began to flash before his eyes, images of his childhood, his family, like a slideshow in his mind's eye. Time slowed to a crawl and everything went silent. But Giles's attention then returned to the present moment. He didn't want to die, and his hands and feet were still free. So far, the duct tape had only been placed over his eyes, and since he knew this man was going to kill him, he felt he had nothing to lose in at least attempting to fight. He ripped the tape off of his eyes, pushed himself upright, and through tears yelled, "I can't go down like this." "Get back on the ground," the man yelled. Giles didn't comply this time. The man drew his gun and pointed it at him again. Giles moved in and grabbed the end of the barrel, pushing it away from his body. From what Giles could see behind the hockey mask, the man appeared stunned. And from what Giles could feel in his hand, the gun was plastic. What a sense of relief he felt in that moment. The whole balance of power suddenly reversed, he thought. And the man could see this new burst of confidence in Giles's eyes. The man then seized hold of Giles's other hand while Giles continued struggling with the gun. As the plastic gun began to bend, the man looked furious as he demanded Giles to stop. During the struggle, Giles noticed a pair of handcuffs lying on the floor in the center of the garage, reminding Giles what this man probably had in store for him. Giles picked up the cuffs and tossed them into a far corner, and the two men resumed scuffling with each other. Giles kicked his attacker in the groin, but then the man headbutted Giles. Giles punched him in the stomach without much effect. His muscles were still weak. "Not gonna cooperate?" the man asked angrily. "Then this is how it's gonna be." He began punching Giles in the side of the head. "Let me go," Giles demanded. "I promise, I won't tell anyone about this. Just let me go." The man ignored him and continued his efforts to dominate him. Giles tried to push his mask off his attacker's head, but it was on too tight. "If you just do what I tell you to do," the man said, "I'll let you live." Giles continued to struggle while the man punched him mercilessly. Just then, Giles turned to see how far the garage door was open, and as the man grabbed a hold of his jacket, Giles slid right out of it, dropped to the floor, and rolled himself through the slightly ajar garage door and onto the unpaved driveway. The cold night air instantly chilled him as he got up and began to run from the house, only to stumble over and fall almost immediately. His legs weren't working. It was the effects of the stun baton. So he scratched and crawled his way away from the house. But then his attacker emerged from behind the door and grabbed his legs, trying to pull him back into the garage. Loose gravel slipped between Giles's fingers as he had nothing to grab onto for resistance. As his attacker approached the garage door, he had to briefly let go of Giles in order to roll himself back under. And somehow, Giles was able to generate enough adrenaline at this point to get onto his feet and start running. Giles ran between houses and made it as far as the walking path parallel to the road when he stumbled and again fell to the ground. Fortunately for Giles, he looked up and saw a couple walking their dog, and just behind them, a jogger in a tracksuit. The jogger jogged right on past. Meanwhile, as the dog-walking couple approached, he managed to push out a few words at a time. Through his hyperventilation, he said, "There's a guy. He's after me. He's trying to mug me. Please, help me." The couple looked stunned and just stared at Giles, saying nothing. Not knowing what to make of this mess of a man, balled up on the ground and drenched in his sweat. Maybe they thought he was high on something. As the attacker made his way toward the walking path, still wearing his hockey mask, Giles called out, "That's the guy!" Suddenly, the man lifted his mask ever so slightly and said to Giles, "Come on, Frank," motioning him to follow him back towards the garage, as though they were buddies, just joking around. The man returned to the unpaved driveway behind the house and then stopped, turning back around and silently watching, waiting to see what would happen. And then, miraculously, the couple with their dog began walking away. By this time, Giles's attacker had disappeared back inside of the garage, and Giles called out to the couple, "Hey, aren't you going to help me, please?" Neither of them said anything, but then the male turned around and began walking back towards Giles when his female companion called out to him, and he turned back around. "Hey," Giles called out again, "can you at least stand here and wait and make sure I get back into my truck safely?" And once again, the male began walking back towards Giles when his female companion called him back. And so the man did as his partner ordered. Never mind, Giles said under his breath. I'll just do it myself. He watched as the couple with their dog grew smaller in the distance, looking back periodically on their way back to wherever they were going, probably home. And if you're wondering why Giles himself didn't call 911, did he not have a cell phone on him? He had his cell phone on him. He was simply so stunned by the experience that he'd forgotten all about it. Weighing his options in that moment, he chose perhaps the riskiest one, returning to his truck, which was parked in front of the garage, still inhabited by the mysterious stranger in the hockey mask, who wanted him dead for reasons he couldn't fathom. As he returned to his truck, Giles peered beneath the slightly ajar door of the garage and saw the stranger's boots as the man paced back and forth inside the garage. On the floor lay Giles's jacket, and for a brief moment, a wave of boldness surged through him as he considered snatching the jacket right quick, but he thought he'd better not press his luck. Yeah, good thinking there, Giles. As quietly as he could, he took his keys from his pocket, unlocked his truck, and got inside. He shut the truck door, started up the truck, put it in reverse, and got out of there. Driving home, Giles looked at the dashboard time, and it was 8 o'clock. His ordeal, though it felt like an eternity, had started and ended in under an hour. During the drive, however, he had to pull over to the side of the road for a while. The full effects of the stun baton had been delayed and were now reverberating throughout his muscles. Before long, he passed out right there in his truck. He regained consciousness about 20 minutes later, and he then resolved to make it the rest of the way home so he could report this incident to the authorities. Once he got back home, he looked in the mirror and barely recognized the swollen beast staring back at him. He grabbed a bag of frozen peas from the fridge and put it on his face. And though he was so exhausted, all he wanted to do was go to bed, Giles pushed himself to his computer so he could log on to Plenty of Fish and document his entire exchange with Sheena. But when he logged on, he discovered that all of the messages they exchanged, incoming and outgoing, had been deleted. And her profile, the profile username Spiderwebs, had been deleted too. He began to fear that without the proof of this exchange and proof of the person's profile, no one would believe his story. But one thing Giles did have the foresight to do was copy and paste her pictures and the directions she'd given him to that garage into a Word document so he could print it out. Giles went to bed, and in the morning he woke up in near crippling pain from the beating he'd taken, from the electric shocks, and from the entire ordeal he went through. It was a Saturday morning, and he couldn't even think about what had happened. That's how traumatized he was, and also embarrassed. What a chump he had been, he thought, to go through with this date despite all of the warning signs, all of the red flags. So as much as he knew he should go to the police, he decided to sit on it. Maybe he wouldn't even report it. He really just wanted to put the whole thing behind him and move on. And by Saturday night, Giles' swelling had subsided enough that at least at first, no one seemed to notice anything unusual about him, even though he was moving around stiffly like a 90-year-old with arthritis. On Sunday, the pain grew even worse, and his friend Rebecca actually noticed the bruises on his face immediately. She asked him what happened, and he told her the story. "You've got to go to the police," she said. "I know, you're right," Giles agreed, but privately, he still wasn't sure he was going to. Days passed. His coworkers noticed his injuries, and he had to tell them, too, the story of what had happened. Everyone at work insisted that Giles report the incident to the police, and he continued to agree, and even intended to, at some undefined point in the future, but he continued delaying it. The weekend after he was attacked was Thanksgiving in Canada. Now, Thanksgiving in Canada is different from our Thanksgiving in the US in that it's held a month and a half early on the second Monday of October. Giles spent that weekend with his family. And of course, he also told them the story. And all of them, too, urged him to go to police. And it was the same story. Giles agreed while having absolutely no intention of following through anytime soon, if at all. Meanwhile, that same weekend, Friday, October 10th, exactly 1 week after Giles' attack, a 38-year-old man named Johnny Brian Altinger told his friends he'd had a hot date that weekend with a woman he'd met on Plenty of Fish. He sent his workmate, Willie, a link to the profile to show off his prospect. An attractive, young, brown-haired woman clad in only a bikini. 7 p.m. tonight at her place, Johnny wrote in an instant message over his work computer. But her instructions to her house were very weird, he added. "What do you mean?" Willie asked. "She won't give me her phone number or address," Johnny explained, "but I've got these directions to get to the house and I'm supposed to use the garage to enter." Willie agreed that this was bizarre. "When you get there, text me the address." As Johnny got ready for his date, he still couldn't wrap his head around the Rube Goldberg-style meetup. This is some real 007 type crap, he thought. So he called up his friend Dale just to give him a heads up about the situation. "Call me when you get there and give me the address," Dale told him, concerned. A little bit later, Dale's phone rang again. It was Johnny. "Hey, I just left," he said. "She wasn't there, but I met a guy in the garage." "What?" Dell was confused. "Yeah, the guy said he was a filmmaker and he was making a movie. He showed me a replica gun. I'll give you a shout a little later when I get home." Johnny hung up, and a short time later, he sent Dale an email. "She's home now. I'm heading over again. Hee hee." Several hours later, having not heard from him, Dale rang Johnny's phone several times, but it went to voicemail each time. The next morning, he tried again. Same thing. By mid-afternoon, Dale was concerned enough to start reaching out to some of their mutuals. By Sunday, Dale still hadn't heard from Johnny and continued to be unable to reach him. Meanwhile, Johnny's coworker, Willie, noticed Johnny hadn't logged into MSN Messenger, which was the messaging app they used around the office, since Friday afternoon. He sent his workmate a message. "How's it going? You still at that chick's place?" Ordinarily, he'd have assumed things had gone swimmingly well, but the strange circumstances Johnny had shared about the date instead made his coworker feel a creeping sense of dread. That Sunday evening, after Dale finished Thanksgiving dinner at his family's place, he called up their mutual friends, Marcel and Carolyn Souza, and told them he thought Johnny had gone missing. He explained what transpired on Friday, and the friends agreed to accompany him to Johnny's condo. They rapped on his front door and waited for a reply, but no one came to the door, and nobody stirred inside. They headed over to the parking garage and noticed that Johnny's red Mazda was missing from his parking spot, while his motorcycles, he had 2 of them, were both left uncovered. This was unusual. Johnny took good care of his motorcycles and always covered them with a tarp. The following morning, on Thanksgiving, Monday, Willie got an email from Johnny in response to the message he'd sent him over the weekend. Johnny wrote that there was no worries on his end. He and the girl had, quote, hit it off big time. And though it had only been a few days, they're falling hard for each other. He and his new girlfriend would be leaving on a vacation to the tropics right away. "Never done anything so spontaneous," the email concluded. "It would be a great experience to get in before I die." A little later, around 9 a.m., Johnny sent out an email to all of his coworkers and friends, which said that he had met, quote, "an extraordinary woman named Jen, who has offered to take me on a nice long tropical vacation. We'll be staying in her winter home in Costa Rica." He said he wouldn't be back in town for another 2 months, but he'd be checking his email periodically. And then his boss received a resignation email from him. "I thank you for the opportunity," it read, "and rest assured, I would not be leaving unless the new path I've chosen was truly life-altering." His Facebook page, which had been dormant for several weeks, suddenly saw a new status update. "John Altinger is taking off to the Caribbean for a few months. See you all when I get back," it said. Now, if you just listened to our last episode about John Robinson, you're probably experiencing deja vu here. On Facebook, Johnny's relationship status was changed from single to in a relationship. At the same time, his Plenty of Fish profile was deleted, and so was the profile of the young woman he had told his friends he was meeting. Some of Johnny's Facebook friends seemed excited for him and posted replies like, "Have fun, take lots of pictures." But Dale did not share their excitement. He knew Johnny well enough to know that he wouldn't just leave his job and run off to another country with someone he'd just met. And he definitely wouldn't leave his motorcycles, which he'd always protected with a tarp, uncovered to gather dust. Dale wrote Johnny a reply. "Who's going to pick up your brother from the airport?" It was a test question. If it were really Johnny, he wouldn't have any idea what Dale was talking about. However, this message got no reply. Neither did Johnny's boss when he followed up to ask for a forwarding address where they could send his final paycheck. On Tuesday, one of Johnny's coworkers got a response to an earlier message he'd emailed to Johnny about carpooling. "No carpool for me," he said. "I'm taking an extended vacation. Good luck." On MSN Messenger, Johnny's status was changed to, "I've got a one-way ticket to heaven and I'm never coming back." Everyone in Johnny's office was perplexed by his seemingly abrupt, out-of-character departure. A friend of Dale's sent Johnny a message on Facebook and insisted that he phone Dale immediately. Johnny replied that he wouldn't be able to call due to the terrible reception where he was staying. Dale was convinced at this point that Johnny had been murdered. He picked up the phone and called the Edmonton police, explaining everything that had happened. That his friend had gone to meet this woman on Plenty of Fish, and now he's just off on vacation. And as is the case with many missing persons reports, police blew him off. They noted the information with a nonchalance that left Dale feeling frustrated. It seemed like they weren't taking him seriously. To them, it just sounded like Johnny was a single dude going to do what single dudes do sometimes. Dale called back several times throughout the week, and he began to feel like the police saw him as a pest. "Go away already," one cop told Dale. On Thursday, another new status update was published on Johnny's Facebook page, wondering why anyone would leave sun and surf to come back to snow and stress. One of his friends replied with a demand for vacation pictures, but the request was ignored. More and more of Johnny's Facebook friends began connecting privately and talking about the bizarre and concerning situation unfolding before them. Meanwhile, the police continued brushing off not just Dale, but the other friends who were now calling to report their friend missing. On Friday, 1 week from the date, Dell, Marcel, and Carolyn returned to Johnny's apartment, and this time they broke into it through an open window. Inside of the apartment, they found dirty dishes in the sink, his suitcase still in the closet, and his toothbrush and shaving kit left behind. And it was when they found his passport too that it made it pretty clear that Johnny hadn't gone out of the country, as his communications were claiming. All weekend, the friends talked amongst themselves and talked to other friends of Johnny's. And on Sunday, they called the police together to give them the latest information. And this time, a missing persons report was filed with an actual case number. And on Facebook, a Find Johnny page was created. Johnny's friends had given the police all the materials they had gathered, including the directions to the home he was last known to have been. The cops were able to locate the address, and then they got in touch with the rental company that leased it. Investigators learned that the garage was being rented to a man named Mark Twitchell, who lived on the other side of town with his wife and child. Interestingly, in August of that year, Twitchell had posted a Facebook status update which stated that he, quote, has way too much in common with Dexter Morgan. And as I'm sure you know, Dexter Morgan is the serial killer on the Showtime series Dexter. Mark Twitchell seemed like an unlikely suspect for this kind of crime, or honestly any crime. Twitchell was a 29-year-old budding filmmaker who just a year earlier had made local news when he was directing a feature-length, low-budget Star Wars prequel, a fan fiction he had also written called Star Wars: Secrets of the Rebellion. He even succeeded at getting one of the actors from the original Star Wars movie, Jeremy Bulloch, to appear in a cameo. Twitchell had written numerous other screenplays for both features and short films, and just 1 month earlier, he had directed a short horror movie called House of Cards. House of Cards, curiously enough, was about a serial killer who posed as a woman on an online dating site and lured unsuspecting suitors to a rented garage where he ambushed them, tied them up, stole their banking information, and murdered them. On Saturday, October 18th, Twitchell was contacted by police and summoned to the rented garage, where he allowed them inside to search. "When was the last time you were here?" police asked as they looked around the inside of the garage. "Friday, October 10th, he told them. The police found the door leading into the backyard area had been screwed shut from the outside. So they broke through it, and immediately the smell of gasoline and char hit their nostrils. Off to the side, there was an oil drum. What is it with internet killers and their drums? And next to it, a wooden chair and a table. And on the table was a receipt from a hardware store dated October 15th for rubber gloves, plastic sheeting, paper towels, a respirator mask, and a bottle of heavy-duty cleaning solvent. The items had been paid for with a MasterCard. So a few minutes later, one of the officers, Constable Maxwell, took Twitchell inside the police cruiser and asked him to show the officer his MasterCard. Twitchell sat motionless, as though he didn't hear the request. Constable Maxwell repeated, "Can I please see your MasterCard?" Again, Twitchell stared into the distance as though he were in deep thought. "Sir," the officer said sharply enough to penetrate whatever invisible barrier might stand between them, "can I see your MasterCard?" Twitchell opened his wallet and quickly thumbed through it, folding it back up as though there was nothing of interest. But Constable Maxwell had plainly seen the MasterCard in one of the pouches when Twitchell had the wallet open. "Not in there. No, in there," he pointed. Twitchell handed Constable Maxwell the MasterCard, trying not to look as defeated as he felt. The office compared the card number to the last 4 digits on the receipt. And what do you know? It matched. This proved that Twitchell had just lied to the cops about the last time he had been at the property. He told them he had last been out there October 10th, but then there was the receipt found in the backyard dated the 15th. Twitchell was asked to accompany the police back to the station for an interview. Once there, Twitchell explained to Detective Mike Tabler that he was in the midst of producing a short film and he had so much on his mind that he'd totally forgotten he'd been at the property more recently. And he explained that the cleaning supplies were all for the fake blood they'd used when shooting the central scene inside of the garage. Detective Tabler expressed to Twitchell now it was kind of odd that here he was making this kind of short film about a serial killer luring men through dating sites in the same garage they were now investigating a missing person who was lured to this garage through a dating site. He asked them if he'd ever heard of the name John Altinger before, and Twitchell denied that he had. So the cops explained that Altinger had gone to the garage to meet with a woman and some guy ended up being there instead, and that he texted his friends about this shortly before he went missing. Twitchell told the detective he knew nothing about any of this and he didn't know what more to say. But Twitchell had plenty to say. He was pretty chatty and often glib, over-explaining things and offering up lengthy details that weren't relevant to the questioning. The detective recognized these as indicators of guilt and deception, but without anything concrete to hold him, they let Twitchell leave. And the next time he met with detectives, he mentioned something he'd said he'd forgotten to tell them the last time, which was he'd recently purchased a used car off of a woman for just $40, a red 2005 Mazda 3, which happened to be the same kind of car that Johnny Altinger drove, a car that had gone missing, along with Johnny. This is when detectives realized the gravity of what they were dealing with, a likely murder case. They brought Twitchell into the interrogation room while confiscating the Mazda. They ran the registration for the vehicle and it came back to John. The detective now interrogating Twitchell, Detective Bill Clark, told him that he knew he was somehow involved in the disappearance of missing John, and they were going to find out sooner or later. This wasn't going away. "I know you killed that guy," Detective Clark said to him, "and I'm coming to get you. It's only a matter of time." Twitchell at this point shrugged and continued to play dumb, but he did make the crucial mistake, for him that is, of admitting that he had Johnny's keys inside of his vehicle. And then he changed his story and claimed that he'd met Johnny before he went off to Costa Rica. "Yeah, well, we're seizing your car," Detective Clark informed him as the interview wound to a close around 2 a.m. "Well, I just need to get something out of it," Twitchell replied. "You're not getting anything out of that car," Detective Clark said. "I just want to get my cell phone," he pled. "You get nothing," the detective told him. When the interview ended, they put Twitchell on a 24-hour surveillance and obtained search warrants for Altinger's red Mazda, as well as Twitchell's own vehicle, the garage Twitchell was renting, and Twitchell's residence in St. Albert. Among the items they seized from Twitchell's home was his computer. And on the hard drive of his computer, detectives found parts of a deleted document which had been called SK Confessions. They printed it out, and Detective Clark began reading it and was totally blown away by what he was seeing. The document opened with, "This story is based on true events. The names and events were altered slightly to protect the guilty." It went on, "This is the story of my progression into becoming a serial killer. Like anyone just starting out in a new skill, I had a bit of a trial and error in the beginning of my misadventures. Allow me to start from the beginning, and I think you'll see what I mean. What followed was a diary detailing how he'd aspired to be like TV's Dexter and planned to bait and kill adulterous married men. Much like himself, by the way, as his diary also contained numerous entries about his mistress, a woman named Tracy. But then he reasoned that single men would take longer to be missed since they didn't have wives who would be looking for them. They were easier targets. His entries went on to describe how he created a fake profile on Plenty of Fish, lured a single guy to the garage he'd rented, where he was lying in wait, and proceeded to beat and attack the man with a stun baton. And while we know they initially believed this to be a murder confession, the entry went on about how the man overpowered him and escaped. And given that this occurred October 3rd, the Friday before Johnny Altinger disappeared, that meant there was another victim out there, one who had survived the ordeal, and they needed to find him in order to strengthen their case with additional charges. As they continued reading, they read about how Johnny showed up to the garage earlier than expected, surprising Twitchell. And when he left and later returned, Twitchell bludgeoned him and stabbed him to death, dismembering him, and then attempted to burn him in the backyard oil drum. But then Twitchell got spooked when he heard a fire engine's sirens, even though it turned out the fire trucks were headed to another call down the street. That's when he brainstormed and decided that a sewer would be the last place anyone would look for a body. The body would rot away completely, he wrote, before anyone ever discovered the bones, and by then it would be way too late to identify this person. So he put Johnny's remains in garbage bags and tossed them into a storm sewer. Investigators sprayed luminol in the garage and in the trunk of Twitchell's car, which revealed the presence of blood in both places. And the blood in Twitchell's trunk was proven to be Johnny's. Now, with what could only be described as a mountain of evidence, police arrested Twitchell on October 31st, 2008, on Halloween. And remember that couple walking their dog, the couple that Giles earlier in the story tried to get to help him, but they ignored him and kept on walking? It turns out they did call 911 that evening after they got home to report what they'd encountered, though Giles had already left the scene and never made a police report. So the detectives were able to corroborate what Twitchell wrote in his confession diary about the failed attack, and eventually Giles came forward and agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Twitchell was charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder. Twitchell went to trial for first-degree murder, and although it was decided that attempted murder charge would be dropped, Giles testified about his ordeal that night. And of course, the key piece of evidence in the trial was the SK Confessions text file police had recovered from Twitchell's hard drive. The file not only completely documented, in explicit detail, the crimes and all the pre-planning, but also everything that Twitchell was thinking throughout. It really showed how remorseless and calculating he was. And at the end of the trial, he was sentenced to the maximum penalty, life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. This was in 2011. After the trial, he led authorities to where he had dumped Johnny Altinger's remains, and they were able to recover them and return them to his family. This wraps up our second installment about this binge series discussing internet killers. Our next series is coming soon for you to binge. Until then, see you bingers.